The so-called Panama Papers show how the world's rich and powerful use offshore accounts to allegedly hide their wealth. World leaders, politicians, even celebrities have been implicated. But has the system also helped the flow of illegal money around the world? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. It's a system that, although sometimes perfectly legal, has facilitated tax evasion, we're told, government corruption, even criminal activity. A system that gives the rich and powerful a level of anonymity not afforded to other people. Well, the Panama Papers have exposed a shadowy financial system that allows wealthy people to stash their assets abroad. Well, now there are calls for greater transparency. Can the leaks really force a change in how offshore tax havens work? Lots to discuss, but first, Adam Rainey has this report from Panama City.
This small Central American country that lies between the Atlantic and the Pacific is playing an outsized role in the murky world of offshore finance. Mossack Fonseca, the firm at the center of the so-called Panama Papers leak, has set up nearly 250,000 companies over the past 40 years. But the firm's director, an award-winning novelist and former government cabinet minister, says they've broken no laws.
The
law has been renewed in many places. We are a pioneer in due diligence. We have incorporated the standards of other countries. We already have them in Panama, and we are strictly following them and more. Definitely, one does have to be careful, because they are instruments that can be used to commit crimes. But it's the same with a car. If you buy a car at a dealer, and suddenly that person kills someone, the car manufacturer, which would be us, is not at fault for that death. Someone used the car, the driver, to commit that crime.
But there are growing calls for companies like Mossack Fonseca to take far more of an interest in who their clients are and what they're doing.
They often don't know who the end user client is, or often perhaps don't know the purpose of that company or its transaction. That's not their job. I think lots of critics say it should be part of the job of anyone involved in this kind of offshore world, because too many abuses have been committed precisely because no one knows who's doing what.
The Panama Papers show how world leaders and criminal organizations benefit from lax banking laws that offer wealthy investors anonymity.
We're in the heart of Panama City's financial district. There are dozens of banks here, several found on each corner. It shows you just how important the financial sector is to this small country. But the release of these millions of documents has called into question the whole practice of creating offshore companies.
Banking and finance have helped spur Panama's 8% growth between 2010 and 2015. Banking has far fewer oversights here than in other financial capitals. Lawyers have been able to create shell companies for anonymous clients, then wash their hands of any misdeeds of the company.
The fact that these revelations have emerged from Panama tends to suggest, and suggests strongly to me, that there is likely to be criminality involved.
This massive leak, though, is drawing attention to a previously deliberately opaque world. The government here could be forced to make the financial sector more transparent. Adam Rainey, Al Jazeera, Panama City.
So let's make it a little more clearer then about how these tax havens work. And it usually goes something like this. Well, you might have a wealthy individual, often through a close middleman or associates, paying a firm like Mossack Fonseca to create what's called a shell company. Now, that'll be set up in one of a number of tax havens around the world, places which have financial secrecy. Now, a stand-in director is appointed to run the business on paper, though in reality they don't actually own anything. To move the money around, the company has to pretend to make business deals. Fake share traders are one option, so-called loans are another. Sometimes payments are made under the cover of consulting or compensation. Let's bring our guests into the show now. We have joining us from London, George Turner, Director of Finance Uncovered, an investigative reporting and training project. In Oxford, Nick Bryer, Head of Inequality for Oxfam Great Britain. And also in London, Amanda Pinto, Chair of the International Committee of the Bar and Specialist in International Financial Wrongdoing. Welcome to you all. If I could start with George. So the rich and powerful find ways to hide their money in tax havens. It's not a huge surprise. Should we be shocked at all of this?
Well, that's an interesting question. Obviously, we've known about Panama and the BVIs and places like that for many years, and there have been scandals that have come out before, like there was the BVI leaks, there have been other leaks of information, the Swiss leaks. It kind of maybe speaks a bit more to our society and culture in that we like stories or are attracted to stories that involve real people. So if somebody was to say to you, you know, lots of people are engaged in tax avoidance, you might find that mildly interesting. But if somebody said your neighbour is involved in tax avoidance, you may well be much more interested as a human being. So I think that's why these stories become particularly big, because they really show all the guts of the international system and what really happens in a kind of granular way which relates to real people.
A lot of guts definitely being exposed in the papers right now. Amanda, from a legal perspective though, as far as we know, and I know it's still early days, have any laws been broken?
Well, that of course is an interesting question, because these types of companies are entirely legal. It's the use to which they're put which is the real question. And when you think about tax evasion, for example, or you think about money laundering, these sorts of vehicles are very good for their use, because they give anonymity and complexity to following the money and allowing people to see what's really going on.
So the answer, I guess, Amanda, from what you're saying is very possibly, but we don't quite know.
Absolutely. We don't know what laws, if any, have been broken, but the fact of the use of these companies doesn't necessarily of itself mean any laws have been broken at all. They're just really a tool that can be used either legally or for illegal conduct.
Nick, to put it all into perspective, how much does the ordinary person suffer if the elite get to stash their money away, far away from the tax man?
Well, I think that's really what this has to come down to, isn't it? So most of us pay our taxes because it's the right thing to do and because we don't have any choice. When the world's richest individuals and companies decide to exploit these loopholes, to employ armies of tax lawyers and accountants to avoid paying their fair share, then the rest of us miss out. And what that means in real terms, of course, is that we miss out on things which are paid for by taxes, so schools and hospitals and roads and so on. And that's an issue, of course, in richer countries, but it's a much bigger issue if you're in a poorer country where things are more fragile, where government budgets are more stretched. And that means there's kids who should be in school today who aren't, because rich individuals have found ways to not pay their tax, and the governments, those poorer countries, have therefore not had the revenues available to them that they should have done. There's mums giving birth in hospitals without adequate health care, which they were entitled to, which they should have had, but which isn't there because the taxes weren't paid, and therefore the hospitals are underfunded, and so on. So these are the real life impacts. This isn't just an abstract concept of money flying around the world and hidden in these exciting sounding tropical island locations. This is a very real thing for real people.
Well, I thought I saw George there wanting to get in on the discussion. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I mean, one really interesting point about this is, you know, what laws have Mossack Fonseca broken, if any. And yesterday there was an interview where one of the partners was saying, well, we didn't know who half our clients were. Now, in most jurisdictions, that would be completely unacceptable for a law firm not to know who their clients were. It may be that that's why people went to Panama, but I'd be very surprised if the law was that lax in Panama, because there's a general obligation on lawyers and intermediaries and accountants to know who their clients are. The second thing is, you know, he used this example of the car. You know, we're only the car manufacturers. If somebody goes and runs somebody over with the car, that's not our fault. It's a very cute analogy, but it doesn't quite work, because if somebody sold you a defective car, they would be liable and they would be forced to recall those cars. And that's the thing. They set up companies in a particular way, and they set up those companies in a particular way which would allow people to do particular things. So they are culpable in that, in the creation of that system, and they probably knew full well what was going on. And in fact, there was that case of the guy who was involved in North Korea sanctions breaking, and they didn't know for 4 years that one of their clients was based in North Korea and had links to the regime and was a sanctioned entity. So clearly they've just been either asleep at the wheel, to carry on their cars analogy, or creating defective products. But I think it's very unlikely that they've done nothing wrong.
All right, I can see both Nick and Amanda.
George's point there around...
Go ahead then, Nick.
George's point around not knowing is crucial, I think. So people often ask, what's the difference between legal tax avoidance and illegal tax evasion? And often the answer is that there isn't necessarily a difference. It's just we don't know yet. A lot of tax avoidance mechanisms are only legal until they're challenged in court, and then they turn out to be illegal. This whole question of what are people actually doing, who actually owns these companies, without knowing those things, no one can know if these things are legal or not, and whether they're moral or not. And so the crucial thing about these leaks, I think, is that it lifts that anonymity, and you know, going back to what George said at the start, of course that makes it more interesting for all of us, but it also makes it more real. It makes it more transparent. And the problem, of course, with going back to your first point around whether the system is flawed, we shouldn't be depending on the actions of a whistleblower. We shouldn't be relying on investigative journalism to know what's going on with our global tax system. These things are right. Fundamental issues that citizens and governments should have a right to know about.
I'm glad you raised that point. Look, I take it to Amanda. I don't want us to get bogged down in too much nitty-gritty legal detail, but obviously, you know, when people talk about, well, how is it that Fonseca didn't know who the owners were or didn't know this or that, surely we're not going to try and put this all down to the actions of one legal firm or accounting firm. I mean, there obviously is some sort of regulatory system that allows tax havens to function, right?
Yes, and actually that really is the point, isn't it? What is the reason that somebody would use such a system? Why would they go to Panama rather than registering, for example, in the UK? And the answer is likely to be anonymity and less regulation, and those two, and indeed less taxes, and regulation and less taxes and anonymity all mean obviously make for less transparency, and that system allows for abuse. That is why we have become more and more regulated as a society, and indeed the EU and international obligations generally, as my fellow panellists were saying, require more and more transparency in the way things are run, and these types of places seem to be operating at a different level.
That's an interesting point, and I'm wondering, Nick, what your perspective is, whether places like Panama, you know, they have, obviously, they're part of this issue, obviously, in their laws and systems. But is it all down to simply because certain countries want to legalize a sort of offshore system, want to become a financial center? Or is it also because powerful elites in the rest of the world, the argument goes, benefit from these sorts of havens and turn a blind eye to it?
Well, I think what we've seen in these leaked papers is exactly that some of the world's most powerful people are benefiting directly. And it's important to note that these tax havens, the kind of place we're talking about, Panama, British Virgin Islands and so on, they are in themselves not the world's most powerful countries, right? The global tax system is not dictated by countries like Panama. It's dictated by the world's most powerful nations, and they're allowing this to continue. Countries like the British Virgin Islands are, in fact, very directly connected to the UK. The UK government could be doing far more on this, because a lot of the biggest tax havens, the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands and so on, do actually fall under the UK crown and can be directly influenced by them if the UK chose to do so. So absolutely we should be asking questions around what powerful interests in Washington, in London and so on are blocking this kind of action.
That's a scary thought in a sense, as well as an interesting one. George, will anything change then? I want to read to you this quote by Fergus Finlay, former senior member of the Irish Labour Party, who wrote April 5th following these Panama revelations, if we can call them that. And he says, of course, no laws have been broken as far as we know so far. That's the great thing about having lots of assets. You get to have a lot of influence over how public policy is made. And sort of the idea there that the powerful make the rules that allow the loopholes, that allow them to stash it away, and the cycle goes on. Will anything ever change, do you think, George?
Well, I think that is a very important point, is that these things are all very symbiotic and they feed off each other. The political system feeds off the financial system, which feeds off the offshore system. But I think events like this, leaks like this, are extremely important in shining a light on this and keeping up public pressure, and things might change at a very granular and slow pace, and we'd like them to change much, much more quickly. But I think there probably will be some change. What we see in that change is true. If I could just pick up on the point you made of this whole point about illegality and legal tax avoidance and illegal tax evasion. I mean, obviously you could hold things through an offshore structure in a perfectly legal way and structure it in a legal way, but I think the possibilities to do that are much smaller than people are trying to make out. At the end of the day, there are a few people who are tax exiles. They go and live in the Bahamas and they enjoy their wealth in the Bahamas tax-free. But most people using tax havens live somewhere else. They live in Europe, or they live in South America, or anywhere else in the world. And therefore, the question is whether they're declaring those assets in the countries where they live, in the countries where they're earning their money, and in their countries where they're generating that economic activity. And the offshore system makes that almost impossible to understand and to know. So, it's very difficult to understand how somebody who is living, for example, in the UK, making their money in the UK, and sending it offshore, could keep it offshore tax-free in a legal way. It may be that they're not declaring it, but that's evasion. But that's the real crux of this issue. How do you create a legal structure for tax avoidance when you're earning stuff in a different country? And it's very, very difficult to do, and much, much smaller in scope than I think many people would like us to believe.
Very difficult to do, but a lot of parties also... Yeah, go ahead, Amanda.
I was just going to say, you were asking about will things change, and I think it's probably worth remembering that regulation has really come on very, very quickly globally in the last decade or so. It's really changed out of all recognition, and a lot of people think that perhaps the global credit crisis couldn't have happened if the regulators had been acting in the way that they act now. So I think there is.
But is it being applied fairly,
pressure.
Amanda? I think is the point. Many people seem to think that there's one rule for one and one for the other when it comes to. I mean, the nurses and teachers, as one article I read said, are not the ones who've got offshore tax accounts. It's according to these leaks, it's leaders, world leaders, and their relatives. And
yes, yeah, absolutely. I was actually going to make a different point, which is you said, is this going to change? And I think the answer is yes, it will, because I think as a result of this sort of leak, public opinion will put pressure onto the global political spectrum to sort of press for greater regulation throughout the world. And I think we see that in international treaties. So I think although at the moment these are, as it were, outside of that loop, allowing and enabling the most powerful and the wealthiest to behave in a way that others can't, and to benefit in a way that others can't, and therefore not having a level playing field, I think that's likely to change.
It's likely to change then. But George, at the beginning, you were talking about how we've had other crises. I think you mentioned the Swiss banking scandals and so on and so forth, and not a lot had changed. Do you share the optimism Amanda has going forward, that this time it's different?
Well, I mean, we've heard this time it's different before, so I don't know if I would say that I'm optimistic, but I think there will be some change. Whether that change will be good enough, whether it will leave other loopholes open, these are why campaigners like Nick are important, to keep the pressure on all the time. And although he said we shouldn't rely on investigative journalists to uncover these things, that's right, but what a great thing that we have investigative journalists that do. So I'm sure this story will continue for months and years to come. This is definitely not going to be a case where this is a big bang and the world is just going to decide to end this tomorrow and it's over, although that would probably be a nice thing. And this will be a story I'm sure you'll be revisiting on this programme and others.
I fear you may be right there, George. Nick, a lot of parties are obviously involved in what's been going on. I mean, we can't put this simply even down to governments and the elite and rich people in the world. That apparently banks may be involved in this kind of activity? We shouldn't forget in 2014, Credit Suisse paid fines, I think $2.5 billion for allegedly helping rich Americans evade taxes. HSBC in 2012 paid almost $2 billion in fines too. There are a lot of players in this game, if we could put it that way, right?
Absolutely, and I think there's serious questions to be asked about those middlemen, if you like, including the law firms like Mossack Fonseca, including the banks, also including the big auditing firms, people like PwC and Deloitte and so on, who've also got a role to play because they are centrally involved in managing the tax affairs of a lot of companies and a lot of individuals. So there's real questions to ask about both the regulation and the ethics that are at play for those middlemen. As you say, it's very complex, and George is obviously right. This is not going to be solved overnight. I think we can be optimistic that there will be some progress following on from this. I think there's a huge onus on all of us, on the civil society, on the media, on ordinary citizens, to ensure that this isn't just a one-off media story, but that we keep the pressure up and that we do insist that there's real meaningful change this time.
Luckily on this show we have a lawyer. Let's turn to Amanda then. What sort of simple, if you could break this huge problem down into simple steps, what sort of simple changes could we make to readdress the situation that, a lot of private and ordinary individuals these days complain that they feel their privacy, their anonymity is being eroded, and yet we hear, it appears that there's a different set of rules for the rich and powerful. How can you, and let's not forget, not all money in offshore havens is doing something wrong. Now, you as a lawyer, when you pick through this minefield, do you see some simple changes? You say, well, right, let's do ABC and sort of address that would help address the situation.
Well, there have been suggestions about some of the things that could be done, such as requiring a register of the actual beneficiaries, as we're about to have in the UK in June here, the actual beneficiaries of companies, and one knows that that's happened in relation to property ownership in London. But I think that that's something that could be considered more broadly. And I suppose the real point here is transparency. And
should the rich and powerful be
customer
subject to more transparency and higher sort of standards for scrutiny?
Well, isn't the real point here that, in a sense, what's being said is that they are avoiding the standards that everybody else has to comply with? So, in a sense, what you're doing is making the playing field level. The difficulty, of course, is that the reasons behind anonymity may or may not be good ones, and the reason people put their affairs in a particular order may or may not be good ones. But the reality is, you ask what changes could be made, and I suppose one of the frustrations that's really been exemplified is when people talk about knowing your client, it doesn't mean getting a bill with their electricity bill, or it doesn't mean being shown a passport. What you really need to know is who is the actual client,
right?
And that needs to be meaningful.
Let me bring in Nick then for a final thought going forward. What would you like to see changed or done as a result of these revelations, Nick?
I think Amanda's absolutely right. I think publicly available registers of who is really the beneficiaries of these companies and forcing, we're talking mostly here about individual tax avoidance and evasion, but also forcing the world's big multinationals similarly to report publicly on what they're earning and what taxes they're paying. I think that's the real key first step to levelling the playing field and making sure we don't keep having stories like this coming out again in coming years.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Let's thank our guests for now, Nick Bryer, George Turner and Amanda Pinto. And thank you for watching too. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.